I still remember the exact moment my world collapsed. Standing in that same house where I was raised, while my own family laughed as if I didn't exist. They thought I was weak. They thought I would stay silent forever. But what they didn't know was I had already started collecting every secret they buried, and the day of their downfall was closer than they ever imagined. Disclaimer: this story is a fictional dramatized narration inspired by common revenge and betrayal themes. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. I still don't know when exactly I stopped feeling like I belonged in my own home. It wasn't one single moment. It was more like a slow erosion, as if every day something inside me was being quietly taken away and replaced with something heavier. Something that told me I was unwanted. My name would be called only when there was work to be done, or when someone needed something fixed, cleaned, or delivered. Otherwise, I was invisible. Not ignored in a dramatic way, but in a way that felt worse, like I was just expected to exist without being acknowledged. It started with small things. Meals where my portion was accidentally forgotten until I asked. Conversations that would pause when I entered the room and resume as if I had never walked in. My opinions were brushed aside before I even finished speaking. Like my voice carried no weight in decisions that affected me directly. At first, I tried to convince myself it was normal family behavior, that maybe I was being too sensitive. I would tell myself that every household had its dynamics, and mine just happened to be colder. But over time it became impossible to ignore the pattern. My sister would get praised for the smallest effort, while anything I did was met with silence or mild criticism. If I succeeded, it was either expected or downplayed. If I failed, it was highlighted like proof of something they already believed about me. I started noticing how my presence changed the mood of the room. Not in a welcoming way, but like an inconvenience had entered. The worst part was the way they spoke about me when I was just a few steps away, pretending I couldn't hear. I would stand near the kitchen or hallway and catch fragments of conversations that were never meant for my ears. Words like useless, too much trouble, she never learns. Or worse, laughter that followed after my name was mentioned. It wasn't just what they said, it was the ease with which they said it. Like I wasn't even human enough to deserve restraint. I remember one evening clearly, though nothing about it was extraordinary at first glance. I came home later than usual after helping someone outside, my hand still carrying the marks of a long day. I expected nothing special, maybe just a quiet meal, or even just being left alone. Instead, I walked into a conversation that stopped the moment I stepped inside. My father looked at me with that tired expression he always had when I was involved in anything. As if my existence itself was exhausting for him. My mother didn't even look up properly. My sister gave a small smirk that she tried to hide behind her phone. I asked a simple question, something about the household plans for the next day, and the response I got wasn't even verbal at first. It was a sigh. A long, dismissive exhale from my father, as if I had interrupted something important by simply speaking. Then he said, without looking at me properly, that I should stop asking unnecessary questions and focus on things I actually understood. That sentence should have been small, forgettable even, but it didn't land like that. It landed like a final verdict on my entire existence. That night, I stayed awake longer than everyone else. I remember sitting in a corner of my room, listening to the house settle into silence, yet feeling like I was still surrounded by noise. Not external noise, but internal, the kind that builds up when you are constantly made to feel like you don't matter. I started replaying every moment I had ever been dismissed, every time I had been laughed at without reason, every instance where I had been treated as less without any explanation. What hurt most wasn't even the cruelty itself. It was the acceptance of it, how easily it had become normal for them to treat me like that, like I had no emotional threshold worth respecting. Like I would always stay, always adjust, always swallow whatever was thrown at me without question. Somewhere in that silence, something inside me started shifting. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that made everything feel different the next morning when I woke up and saw the same faces again, acting like nothing had ever happened, while I stood there quietly realizing I was already beginning to detach from the version of myself that still believed I could be seen by them as anything more than a burden. After that night, something changed in the way I moved through my own house. It wasn't sudden or obvious to anyone else, but I could feel it with every step I took. I started becoming more careful, more silent, more aware of when I was allowed to speak and when I wasn't. It was like living inside invisible rules that no one had ever explained to me, but everyone expected me to follow perfectly. I learned the timing of footsteps in the hallway, the tone of voices in the kitchen, the exact moments when I should disappear into my room so I wouldn't become an inconvenience. In my own home, I began to feel like a guest who had overstayed their welcome. I would wake up early just to avoid interactions, and I would delay coming out of my room until I was sure the mood of the house was safe enough to exist in. Even then, I would keep my presence minimal. Like reducing myself could somehow make me less noticeable, less bothersome, less wrong in their eyes. But no matter how small I made myself, it never felt like enough. There was a strange routine that developed. My sister would wake up and immediately receive attention, conversations, and soft voices around her. My mother would ask her about her plans, her needs, her feelings. My father would sometimes even joke with her, something I realized I had never really been part of. I would sit there quietly, eating or pretending to be busy, watching how easily affection flowed in her direction while I remained on the outside of everything, like a shadow in the same space. When I tried to join conversations, I noticed how quickly they would shift or end. It wasn't always direct rejection. Sometimes it was subtle enough to make me question myself. A change in tone, a short answer, a distracted glance, and I would instinctively step back again. Over time, I stopped trying altogether. It became easier to expect nothing than to keep facing that quiet form of dismissal. What hurt most was how normal it had become for them to treat me like I was emotionally separate from the family. Decisions about household matters were made without me. Plans were discussed in front of me as if I was not part of them. Even small things like outings or purchases were decided collectively, except I was never really part of that collective. I was informed, not included. And even when I was informed, it felt more like an obligation than an invitation. At school or outside, I tried to act normal. I would smile when needed, respond when spoken to, and pretend like I didn't carry a heaviness that followed me everywhere. But the moment I returned home, it was like stepping back into a space where I had to shrink again. The contrast between how I was treated outside and inside started becoming more painful. Outside, I was at least acknowledged as a person. Inside, I was reduced to a role that existed only when needed. There were days when I would sit near the window in my room, watching the world outside and wondering how different it would feel to live in a place where I wasn't constantly aware of my worth being measured. I started questioning if I had done something wrong to deserve this treatment, even though I couldn't identify what that wrong could possibly be. That confusion slowly turned into self-doubt, and that self-doubt slowly turned into silence. The house itself began to feel colder, not physically, but emotionally. Conversations rarely included me unless necessary. Even when I was physically present, I felt mentally excluded. My presence was tolerated, not embraced. I started noticing how my opinions were either ignored or subtly corrected, as if I couldn't be trusted to understand things correctly. That constant correction made me second-guess everything I thought or said. One evening, I overheard a conversation between my parents about future plans, something about responsibilities and expectations. My name came up briefly, not as a participant, but as a reference point for limitations. The way they spoke about me wasn't angry or emotional. It was factual, almost like I was a problem they had already categorized and accepted. That realization didn't hurt loudly. It hurt quietly, in a way that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. I started withdrawing even more after that. Not out of rebellion, but out of survival. If I wasn't going to be included, I thought maybe I could at least avoid the constant reminder of being excluded. I began spending more time alone, avoiding shared spaces unless absolutely necessary. The house felt less like a home and more like a place I was temporarily staying in without permission to fully exist within it. Even in silence, I could feel the difference in how I was perceived compared to my sister. She could make mistakes and still be comforted. I could do everything correctly and still be questioned. That imbalance became so consistent that I stopped expecting fairness altogether. I learned to accept silence as my default state and invisibility as my role in the family. And I kept living that way without realizing how deeply it was changing me. Inside, I didn't expect betrayal to feel like this. People always describe it as something loud, something dramatic, something you can point at in a single moment and say, that's when it happened. But for me, it was quieter than that. It came in fragments, in small inconsistencies that didn't make sense at first, until they slowly started forming a picture I didn't want to see. It began with something I overheard completely by accident. I wasn't trying to listen. I was just walking past the living room when I heard my name. That alone should have been normal, but the tone made me stop. There was something different in the way my mother said it, like she was discussing a subject, not a person. I stayed still, hidden just enough that I could hear without being seen, and what I heard next made my chest feel heavy in a way I couldn't immediately explain. They were talking about me like I was a responsibility they were tired of carrying. Not in an emotional, frustrated way, but in a calculated, almost practical tone. My father spoke about future arrangements and reducing unnecessary burden, words that didn't sound like they belonged to a family conversation. My sister chimed in occasionally, not with defense, not with concern, but with agreement. That part hurt more than anything else. The realization that I wasn't just being dismissed, I was being evaluated. I remember standing there, completely frozen, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood. Maybe they were talking about something else. Maybe I was misinterpreting. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. They weren't just frustrated with me. They were actively building a narrative in which I was the problem that needed managing. The worst part wasn't even what they said, but how naturally they said it. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no awareness that I was even a person who would be hurt by hearing it. It was as if I was already emotionally removed from the family in their minds, and they were simply discussing logistics around that decision. After that moment, I started noticing other things I had ignored before. The way my sister would sometimes look at me when no one else was paying attention. Not with hatred, but with something colder. Like quiet superiority. The way conversations would suddenly stop when I entered, not always abruptly, but smoothly, as if my presence required a change in topic. The way decisions that affected me had already been finalized before I was even informed. There was one specific incident that made everything feel undeniable. A family matter came up that required input from everyone, or so I thought. I remember sitting at the table, waiting for my turn to speak, thinking maybe this would be one of those rare moments where I was actually included. But before I could even start, my father summarized the situation and immediately moved on as if my opinion had already been accounted for. It hadn't. I hadn't even spoken. But somehow my silence had already been assumed. I looked at my sister that moment, hoping for some sign of acknowledgement, some shared understanding that something felt off. Instead, she avoided my gaze completely. That avoidance said more than words ever could. It told me she was aware, fully aware, of how I was being treated, and she had already decided where she stood in it. That was when the feeling of betrayal fully settled in. Not just betrayal by one person, but betrayal by the structure of the family itself. It wasn't about a single argument or misunderstanding. It was about being slowly positioned outside of something I still thought I belonged to. What made it more painful was how normal everything looked from the outside. If anyone walked into that room, they would have seen a regular family having a conversation. No shouting, no visible conflict, no dramatic signs of dysfunction. But underneath that surface, I was being quietly removed from the equation. I started replaying earlier moments in my mind, trying to figure out when this had started. Was it always like this? Had I just been too naive to notice? Or had something changed gradually over time without me realizing it? Every memory suddenly felt questionable, like I was reinterpreting my entire life through a new lens that I didn't want but couldn't ignore. The hardest realization was understanding that I had been included in appearances, not in reality. I was present in the household, but not in its decisions. I was part of the structure, but not part of the connection. I was someone they lived with, not someone they truly considered within their emotional circle. After that day, I stopped trying to convince myself otherwise. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment where I demanded answers. Because deep down, I already knew I wouldn't get honest ones. Instead, I started observing more carefully, listening more than speaking, and paying attention to things I had previously ignored. And the more I observed, the clearer it became that what I thought was neglect had been something far more deliberate all along. I didn't discover the truth in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded slowly, like a crack in glass that only becomes visible once light hits it from the right angle. At first, it was something I almost dismissed as a misunderstanding, something too small to matter. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. It started with a document I was never meant to come across. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I was simply helping around the house, moving things from one place to another, when I stumbled upon it. It was placed casually, like it had no importance, but something about the way it was tucked away made me pause. I remember hesitating before opening it, as if my instincts already knew I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. What I saw inside didn't make immediate sense. Names, dates, references to financial decisions, and discussions that I had never been part of. At first, I thought it was related to general family expenses, something routine that didn't involve me. But then I noticed patterns. My name appeared, not as a participant, but as a reference point in decisions I had never been informed about. The more I read, the more my hands started to feel cold. There were mentions of responsibilities assigned in ways that excluded me entirely from decision-making, yet still used my existence as justification. It wasn't just about money or logistics. It was about how I was being positioned in the family narrative without ever being asked what I wanted or how I felt. I put the papers down and sat there for a long time, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood what I was reading. But the language was too clear. There was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. My exclusion wasn't accidental. It was structured. Later that day, I began paying attention in a way I never had before. Conversations that once sounded casual now carried hidden weight. My father would mention things indirectly, decisions already made, but phrased as if they were still open for discussion. My mother would refer to situations involving me without ever actually involving me in the conversation. It was like I existed in their plans, but not in their dialogue. I started noticing how information always reached me late. Important discussions would happen when I wasn't around, and by the time I was informed, everything was already finalized. It wasn't just exclusion anymore, it was controlled inclusion. I was allowed to know things only after they were no longer changeable. One evening, I overheard another conversation that confirmed everything I had been sensing. They were discussing future arrangements again, but this time with more detail. There was talk of expectations, roles, and responsibilities that had been assigned without my consent. The most unsettling part was how comfortable they sounded while discussing it, as if my lack of involvement was completely normal, even logical. I remember standing behind the wall, listening, trying to understand how I had become a subject in decisions about my own life. There was no anger in their voices, no conflict. That was what made it worse. It wasn't cruelty in the traditional sense. It was something more detached, more calculated. As if I had already been placed in a category, and everything they were doing was just management of that category. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying every interaction, every ignored question, every moment I had been quietly dismissed. Things that once felt like emotional distance now looked like evidence. I started connecting dots I had never thought to connect before. Even my presence in the house felt different after that realization. I wasn't just someone being overlooked. I was someone being strategically positioned outside of awareness. Decisions were made around me, not with me. Conversations adjusted themselves when I entered, like I was an external factor rather than an internal part of the system. What hurt the most was realizing how long this had been happening without me fully understanding it. I had always assumed ignorance was accidental, that silence was passive, that exclusion was just a byproduct of family dynamics. But now it looked intentional, consistent, and carefully maintained. There was also something deeply unsettling about how normal everything still looked. From the outside, nothing had changed. The house functioned as it always had. Conversations still happened, meals were still shared, routines still continued. But underneath that surface, I had been quietly removed from the center of it all without anyone ever needing to announce it. I started questioning every memory, every assumption I had ever made about belonging. And the more I questioned, the more I realized that I had been participating in a version of family life that only existed in my interpretation, not in their reality. That realization didn't come with a dramatic emotional collapse. It came with silence. A deep, heavy silence where I finally understood that what I had been trying to fit into wasn't broken, it was never designed to include me in the first place. There's a kind of breaking point that doesn't look like breaking at all. It doesn't come with shouting or tears or visible collapse. For me, it arrived quietly, like something inside me simply stopped waiting for things to get better. I remember the exact feeling sitting alone in my room, staring at nothing in particular, realizing that I was exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was something deeper, something that had been building for years without me fully naming it. That day didn't start differently from any other. I followed the same routine, moved through the same spaces, responded when spoken to, stayed silent when ignored. But something inside me felt detached, like I was watching my own life from a distance rather than living it. Every interaction felt rehearsed, every response automatic, every moment predictable in its disappointment. I started noticing how I no longer expected kindness, or inclusion, or even acknowledgement. I had already lowered my expectations so much that nothing surprised me anymore. But what surprised me instead was how calm I felt about that realization. It didn't hit me all at once. It built up through small emotional shocks I had been absorbing without processing. A dismissive comment here, a decision made without me there, a conversation that stopped when I entered, a glance that carried more judgment than words ever needed to express. I had spent so long adjusting to these things that I stopped reacting to them outwardly. But internally, something was shifting. The breaking point came when I found myself sitting at the table during a family discussion that had nothing to do with me, yet somehow still defined me. I was physically present, but mentally absent from their consideration. They spoke about plans, expectations, and responsibilities as if my role was already finalized without my input ever being required. And for the first time, I didn't feel hurt in the way I used to. I felt something colder. Clarity. That clarity was uncomfortable because it removed all the illusions I had been holding on to. I could no longer pretend that I was misunderstood or temporarily overlooked. I could see the pattern now, fully and completely. I wasn't part of their emotional system. I was part of their structure. And structures don't require emotional participation. They just require function. When I excused myself and went back to my room, I didn't cry. I didn't react. I just sat there, replaying everything I had ever ignored, and for the first time I stopped trying to justify it. The constant need to explain their behavior in a way that made it less painful, it started disappearing. I stopped asking, why are they like this, and started accepting, this is how it is. That acceptance didn't bring peace. It brought something sharper. Determination. Because once you stop expecting change from people who have no intention of changing, you are left with only two choices: accept it forever, or change your position in it. And I realized I couldn't survive the first option anymore. Not emotionally, not mentally. Something in me had already reached its limit, even if I hadn't spoken it out loud yet. That's when the planning started, not in a dramatic way, but in fragments of thought that began forming naturally. I started observing instead of reacting. I began listening more carefully, not for connection, but for patterns. I paid attention to what they valued, what they dismissed, what they feared being exposed. I stopped thinking like someone trying to be included, and started thinking like someone trying to understand the system they had been placed inside. At first, it was just awareness, not action, not revenge, just awareness. I would sit quietly and mentally note things I used to ignore. Who made decisions? Who influenced them? What information was controlled? What was hidden? What was openly discussed? I started seeing the structure of the household not as a family unit, but as a hierarchy I had never been officially part of. The emotional shift was subtle but significant. I stopped seeking validation in conversations. I stopped expecting fairness in decisions. I stopped reacting when I was dismissed. Instead, I began collecting moments internally, not to relive the pain, but to understand the system behind it. There was a strange relief in that detachment. Pain didn't disappear, but it became organized instead of chaotic. I could finally see it clearly instead of drowning in it. And clarity, even when painful, is powerful. One night, I remember sitting in complete silence, thinking about everything I had endured without protest. And for the first time, I asked myself not how to survive it, but how to change it. That question felt different. It didn't come from sadness. It came from refusal. From that point on, I began shifting internally. Not outwardly, not yet. Outwardly continued as usual. I still spoke when necessary, still followed routines, still existed within their expectations. But inside, I was no longer just absorbing everything. I was storing it, analyzing it, understanding it in a way I never had before. And with every passing day, the emotional weight that had once kept me passive started turning into something else entirely. Something that no one around me had noticed yet, was already beginning to reshape everything I believed about what would come next. It started with something so ordinary that I almost ignored it, like all the other details I had been conditioned to overlook. But after everything I had begun to notice, nothing felt truly ordinary anymore. Even silence had meaning now. Even casual words carried weight. So when I found myself alone with the opportunity to confirm what I suspected, I didn't hesitate the way I would have before. I began by revisiting things I had already seen but never fully understood. Small fragments of information, half-overheard conversations, documents left carelessly in places they shouldn't have been, and digital traces that were never properly secured. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. I just knew I needed clarity, something undeniable enough that I could no longer dismiss it as misunderstanding or emotional exaggeration. The more I paid attention, the more patterns started to form. It wasn't chaos. It was structure. Controlled structure. Certain conversations only happened when I wasn't around. Certain topics disappeared the moment I entered a room. Certain decisions were always finalized before I was informed. And every time I tried to piece it together emotionally, I ended up confused. But when I started looking at it logically, as a system instead of a family dynamic, everything began to align. I realized I was no longer reacting to events as they happened. I was documenting them mentally. Every interaction became data. Every contradiction became evidence. Every dismissal became a signal. I wasn't trying to confront anything yet. I was trying to understand how deep it went. There were moments where I had to pretend nothing had changed. That part was the hardest. Sitting at the same table, listening to the same voices, while internally analyzing every sentence for hidden meaning. Smiling when required. Responding when necessary. Acting like the same version of myself they were used to seeing, while slowly building a completely different awareness underneath it. The most important shift happened when I stopped asking myself how I felt about things, and started asking why things were happening the way they were. That change in perspective was dangerous because it removed emotion from the center of my thinking. And once emotion was no longer leading my interpretation, patterns became much clearer. I noticed how information was selectively shared. Not everyone in the house knew the same things at the same time. Some decisions were discussed privately long before they were presented as family decisions. My presence or absence in those moments determined whether I was included in the narrative or simply assigned a role afterward. I also started recognizing how perception was being shaped around me. Certain phrases would be repeated about me when I wasn't present, slowly forming an image that I was never directly allowed to challenge. I wasn't being openly attacked. I was being defined without input. and that definition was becoming more important than my actual reality inside the house. At some point, I stopped seeing these things as random and started seeing them as intentional patterns of control. Not dramatic control, not obvious manipulation, but subtle steering of perception, information, and inclusion. Everything had a flow, and I was always slightly outside the main current. That realization didn't make me emotional anymore. It made me focused. I began documenting everything mentally with more precision. Who said what? When it was said? Who was present? Who was excluded? How reactions changed depending on context. I started noticing inconsistencies that I had ignored for years simply because I never thought to question them. One of the most unsettling discoveries was how predictable it all was once I stepped outside of my emotional involvement. The system didn't adapt to me. It operated around a fixed pattern where my position never truly changed. I was either being assigned responsibility without authority, or being excluded entirely from decisions that still affected me. As I continued observing, I also began testing silence. Not by confronting, but by withholding reactions I normally would have given. I stopped immediately responding to things that were said about me. I stopped seeking clarification when I was excluded. I simply watched how things unfolded without inserting my emotional presence into the situation. What I found was revealing. The structure didn't react to my silence. It continued functioning exactly as before, which meant my participation, my reactions, my emotions, they were never required for the system to operate. That realization created a strange sense of separation between me and everything I had once considered my normal life. At the same time, I began preparing internally for something I couldn't yet name. Not revenge in the immediate sense, but readiness. The kind of readiness that comes from understanding how something works well enough that it can no longer surprise you. I wasn't planning an emotional response anymore. I was building awareness of leverage, truth, and timing. Every new piece of information I gathered made one thing clearer: nothing I had experienced was accidental. It was structured, consistent, and maintained over time. And once something is structured, it means it can also be exposed, because structure always leaves traces, no matter how carefully it is built. By the time I fully accepted that, I had already stopped seeing myself as someone reacting to a situation. I had started seeing myself as someone preparing for the moment when all those hidden patterns would no longer remain hidden, and that shift changed everything about how I moved forward from that point onward. I learned how to live two versions of myself at the same time, and neither of them could fully exist in the same space anymore. On the outside, I was still the same quiet presence they were used to. I still responded when spoken to, still followed routines, still moved through the house without drawing attention. I became predictable, again on purpose. That predictability was my cover. It kept everything stable enough for me to observe without interference. But inside, something completely different was happening. Every interaction became controlled. Every expression became measured. I stopped reacting emotionally in the way I used to, especially when I felt dismissed or ignored. Instead of showing anything on my face, I stored it. I recorded it mentally with precision, like each moment had become part of a growing internal archive. The more I stayed silent, the more I noticed how much information people revealed when they believed I wasn't paying attention. There is a strange power in being underestimated repeatedly. People stop filtering themselves around you. They stop adjusting their words, their tone, their behavior. They assume you are not paying attention, or worse, that you are not capable of understanding what is happening around you. And in that assumption, they become careless. That carelessness became my advantage. I began noticing details I had never paid attention to before: who made decisions when no one was formally discussing them, who influenced conversations without speaking much, who changed their behavior depending on who was in the room. I stopped focusing on what was being said directly to me, and started focusing on everything said around me. At home, I continued to play my role. I answered questions briefly, avoided unnecessary conversation, and kept my emotional reactions neutral. If something hurt, I didn't show it. If something surprised me, I didn't react. That silence created a new perception around me, one that I intentionally allowed to form. They started seeing me as withdrawn, possibly detached, maybe even resigned. That assumption worked in my favor. Because while they thought I was stepping back, I was actually stepping deeper into observation. There were moments when I would sit in the same room as them, listening to conversations that were not meant for my awareness, while pretending to be focused on something else entirely. I learned how to divide my attention in a way that made me invisible while still fully present. I could hear every detail without ever appearing engaged. And the more I listened, the more I understood how carefully things had been structured around me for a long time. Not in a loud or obvious way, but in patterns so consistent that they had become invisible to anyone not actively looking for them. At the same time, I began practicing emotional control in a way I had never done before. It wasn't suppression anymore. It was discipline. I stopped letting immediate emotional reactions guide my behavior. Instead, I allowed myself time before responding to anything internally. That gap between feeling and reaction became my space of control. During this phase, I also started preparing mentally for something I could not yet openly act on. I didn't rush it. I didn't force it. I simply allowed everything I observed to accumulate without interference. Every inconsistency, every exclusion, every dismissive moment, it all added to something larger that was slowly forming in my understanding. There was a growing awareness that the truth I had discovered earlier was not isolated. It was connected to many smaller truths I had ignored for years. And once I started connecting them, the structure became undeniable. What made this phase even more powerful was the contrast between how I was perceived and how I actually was. To them, I was becoming quieter, more distant, easier to overlook. But internally, I was becoming more aware, more focused, more precise in my understanding of everything happening around me. I also started noticing how conversations changed when I was present, versus when I wasn't. The difference was subtle but consistent. Certain topics would disappear when I entered a room. Certain tones would shift. Certain expressions would reset. That behavior alone confirmed something I had already begun to suspect, that my awareness was not something they fully accounted for. So I leaned into that invisibility even more. I allowed myself to be underestimated fully. I became the version of myself that required no attention, no consideration, no adjustment from them. And in doing so, I gained access to something they didn't realize they were giving me, freedom to observe without resistance. At night, when the house was quiet, I would replay everything in my mind, not emotionally, but analytically. I started seeing connections between events that were previously scattered and meaningless. I began understanding how decisions were shaped, how roles were assigned, and how perceptions were maintained without anyone needing to explicitly enforce them. What I was building wasn't a reaction, it was structure of understanding. And within that structure, I could already see that everything I had been experiencing was moving toward a point where silence would no longer be enough, and observation would eventually turn into something far more deliberate than anything they were prepared for. By the time things started shifting around them, I had already stopped looking surprised by anything. I didn't need confirmation anymore. I didn't need emotional validation. I had reached a point where I could see the pattern of consequences forming long before they fully arrived. And what made it even more powerful was that they still believed nothing had changed. From their perspective, everything was normal. The house functioned the same way it always had. Conversations still flowed in predictable directions. Decisions were still made in the same closed circles. I was still the quiet presence in the background, the one who didn't interfere, the one who didn't question too much, the one who, in their eyes, had settled into her place. But what they didn't realize was that their version of normal had already been quietly destabilized. It began with small fractures, things that didn't seem connected at first. A disagreement that escalated more than expected. A financial misunderstanding that suddenly became difficult to explain. A conversation where someone unintentionally contradicted something said earlier. On their own, each incident looked minor. But together, they started forming a pattern that no one was consciously tracking except me. I wasn't doing anything obvious. I wasn't confronting anyone. I wasn't exposing anything yet. I was simply no longer participating in the illusion the same way. And that shift alone was enough to change the balance, even if they didn't understand why. For years, the structure had depended on predictability. Everyone knew their role. Everyone reacted in expected ways. And my role had always been the least visible one, the one that absorbed, complied, and remained silent. But silence, when it changes in quality, becomes noticeable even without words. I had stopped reacting the way I used to. I no longer offered explanations when something didn't include me. I no longer asked questions that would be dismissed. I no longer tried to fit myself into conversations that were never designed to hold me properly, and that absence of reaction created something they weren't prepared for: uncertainty. At first, they didn't acknowledge it. People rarely do. They assume stability is permanent until it starts costing them something. But slowly, their decisions started becoming less coordinated. Information stopped flowing as smoothly between them. Assumptions they used to rely on about my compliance no longer held the same reliability. I noticed how they started recalculating their tone around me without realizing it. Not dramatically, but subtly. A pause before speaking. A second thought before dismissing something. A slight hesitation where there used to be none. These were not conscious changes, but they were real, and I didn't interrupt it. I let it grow. There was a moment when I realized that exposure doesn't always begin with revelation. Sometimes it begins with inconsistency. When people who are used to control start losing certainty, even in small ways, they begin to adjust their behavior, and those adjustments eventually expose what they were trying to keep stable. That's what I was watching now. At home, I continued to play the same quiet role. But internally, I was tracking everything. Who aligned with whom in conversations, who contradicted themselves when stressed, who became defensive when certain topics were indirectly touched. I started noticing emotional pressure points without ever directly applying pressure myself. It was no longer about gathering information. It was about understanding structure deeply enough that it would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. And then came the moment that confirmed everything I had been observing. A situation arose that required coordination between all of them. Something that, in the past, would have been resolved quickly because everyone operated under assumed clarity. But this time, there was hesitation. Conflicting statements appeared without resolution. One version of events did not match another, and instead of immediate correction, there was confusion. I sat there silently, watching them try to align their narratives in real time. And for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like someone observing a system struggling to maintain itself without realizing it had already started slipping. No one looked at me for help. No one asked for my input. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Because the less they involved me in their attempts to stabilize things, the more clearly I could see how unstable it already was. After that moment, something changed in how they interacted with each other. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Conversations became slightly more cautious. Statements were phrased more carefully. Certain topics were avoided entirely in mixed presence. It was as if they were slowly becoming aware that the internal consistency they relied on was no longer guaranteed. And I stayed exactly where I was supposed to be in their perception: quiet, observant, non-interfering. But internally, I was no longer passive. I was watching the early stage of something they still didn't have a name for, but I already understood what it was becoming. The day it happened didn't feel special at first. That was the strange part about moments that change everything: they rarely announce themselves. The morning followed its usual rhythm, the same voices in the same rooms, the same expectations floating around like invisible rules I had already learned not to challenge. But beneath my calm exterior, something was different. Not emotional chaos, not hesitation, but a quiet certainty that I'd crossed a point of no return long before this day arrived. I moved through the house like I always did, answering only when necessary, keeping my expressions neutral, observing more than participating. They didn't notice anything unusual because I had trained them not to. For weeks, maybe longer, I had been reinforcing the version of me they believed they understood. The quiet one. The compliant one. The one who didn't question too much. That version had become my shield, and today it would also become their blind spot. The gathering wasn't planned around me. It never was. That detail alone said everything about how they still perceived my place in the structure. Family conversations, relatives visiting, discussions about decisions that affected multiple lives. These things always happened in rooms where I was physically present but mentally excluded. That pattern never changed. Until today, it worked in their favor. I remember standing slightly apart, listening to fragments of conversation that carried the same tone I had grown used to: confident, dismissive, certain. They spoke as if every narrative was already settled, as if reality only existed in the version they agreed upon. My name would occasionally appear in passing, not as a subject of consideration, but as a reference point in decisions already made. That was the moment I decided I was done being a reference point. I didn't interrupt immediately. I waited. Timing mattered more than emotion. I let the conversation continue, let them settle into the comfort of assuming control. Let them speak freely in the way people do when they believe there will be no consequence to their words. I could feel the room functioning exactly as it always had, unaware that the foundation beneath it was no longer stable. When I finally spoke, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. That would have given them permission to dismiss it as emotion. Instead, my voice was calm, almost controlled in a way that made people instinctively pause without understanding why. At first, they didn't register what was happening. I could see it in their faces. Confusion before comprehension. A delay between hearing and understanding. I started by repeating things they had said in private, not with emotion, but with accuracy. Dates, statements, decisions, conversations they thought were contained. Each detail landed differently when removed from secrecy and placed into open space. The room shifted, not explosively but perceptibly. The air changed when private narratives stopped being private. Someone tried to interrupt me, to redirect the conversation, to reframe what was being said. But I didn't stop. Not because I was louder, but because I was precise. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't interpreting. I was presenting. Every statement I made had context behind it. Every detail had been collected over time, not in anger, but in silence. That silence now spoke for me in ways they couldn't easily counter. As more truth surfaced, I could see the structure I had been observing for so long begin to react in real time. Denials came first. Then confusion. Then attempts to minimize what was being said. But the problem with accumulated truth is that it doesn't depend on tone. It depends on consistency. And everything I was saying aligned too perfectly to be dismissed easily. For the first time, I saw discomfort replace confidence in the people who had always spoken without hesitation around me. Not because I had created something false, but because I had finally made something hidden impossible to ignore. My sister's expression changed before anyone else's. Not anger immediately, but shock mixed with realization. The kind that comes when someone understands they are no longer the only one controlling the narrative. My parents tried to regain control of the situation, speaking over me, attempting to shift attention. But the structure they relied on wasn't responding the same way anymore. People in the room were listening differently now. Not emotionally, but attentively, because what I was revealing wasn't dramatic storytelling. It was interconnected patterns that began making sense when placed together. There was a moment when silence took over. Not forced silence, but collective silence. The kind that happens when everyone in a space is recalibrating what they thought they understood. I didn't rush to fill that silence. I let it exist. Let it settle. Let it do what words could not. Because silence, when it follows truth, carries its own weight. And in that space, I could already see the beginning of something shifting that no one in that room was fully prepared to process. Yet, what followed wasn't loud the way people expect revenge to be. There were no dramatic explosions of emotion from my side, no satisfaction that looked like celebration. Instead, there was a stillness that settled in after everything had already been said. A kind of emotional quiet where the truth no longer needed support from explanation. The room had changed in a way that couldn't be undone. Even after voices slowly returned, even after people tried to reassemble the conversation into something more comfortable. The structure had already cracked. The version of reality they had carefully maintained no longer fit together the same way. Too many pieces had been exposed at once, and no one could fully pretend they hadn't heard it. I didn't stay to watch everything collapse in real time. I didn't need to. That part belonged to them, not me. My role in that moment was simply to stop carrying what was never mine to hold in silence. So I stepped back, not dramatically, not as a statement, but as a final removal of myself from a system that had always functioned without truly including me. The aftermath unfolded in layers. At first, there was denial. Then confusion. Then selective rewriting of what had happened, as if changing interpretation could undo what had already been spoken out loud. But truth, once placed in shared space, doesn't return to secrecy just because it becomes inconvenient. It lingers in the gaps between conversations, in the pauses before speech, in the way people avoid certain topics without agreeing to avoid them. Inside the house, nothing was openly resolved, but everything was different. The tone shifted. The ease disappeared. Even silence felt heavier than before. People who once spoke freely around me now measured their words more carefully, not because I demanded it, but because something had changed in how they perceived consequence. My sister avoided direct interaction with me in the days that followed, not with confrontation but with distance. That distance spoke more clearly than anything she could have said. My parents tried to return to normal patterns, but normal no longer functioned the same way. There were too many unspoken acknowledgments in the air now, too many things that could not be safely ignored again. And I stopped participating in their recovery process. For the first time, I was no longer adjusting myself around their emotional state. I didn't explain myself again. I didn't justify anything I had revealed. I didn't soften what had already been exposed. I allowed my silence to exist without guilt, without obligation, without the need to repair what I did not break alone. There was something unfamiliar about that freedom. It didn't feel like victory in the way people imagine revenge. It felt like weight being removed. Like carrying something heavy for so long that you forget what it feels like not to carry it. In the days that followed, I focused on rebuilding something for myself that had nothing to do with their perception, not out of anger anymore, but out of necessity. I started thinking beyond that house, beyond those roles, beyond the version of myself that had only existed in response to how I was treated. There was no desire to explain myself further. No need to prove what had already been proven in the only space that mattered at that moment. Public exposure had already done its job, not in the sense of humiliation, but in the sense of irreversible awareness. Once people see a pattern clearly, they cannot fully return to the blindness they once had. What remained was distance, not just physical, but emotional separation, from a life that no longer defined me in the same way. I was still in the same environment, but I was no longer part of its internal system. I no longer existed in the same role that had once been assigned to me without consent. There were moments of tension, moments of silence that carried meaning, moments where people seemed unsure of how to interact with me now that the old assumptions no longer applied. But I didn't rush to fill those gaps. I didn't try to restore comfort. Comfort had been the foundation of my invisibility for too long. Instead, I observed the aftermath the same way I had once observed everything else. But this time, I was no longer inside the structure trying to survive it. I was outside it, watching how it reacted to being questioned for the first time in a long time. And in that distance, something finally settled in a way it never had before. Not closure in the emotional sense, but final separation from a version of life where silence was expected from me more than truth, and where existence had always required shrinking instead of standing fully visible as myself. And after everything, there was nothing left I needed to prove to anyone who once defined me by their silence and assumptions. What they called weakness had only been patience. What they mistook for invisibility had only been observation. And what they believed was the end of me had quietly become the beginning of my own life, finally separated from theirs.